Climate change is the long-term shifts in temperatures and weather patterns which may be due to human activities or natural causes such as variations in the solar cycle, volcanoes, and tectonic plate movements. Human activities are the major driver of climate change through burning fossil fuels like coal, oil and gas, deforestation, landfills, rice fields, enteric fermentation of livestock, ozone from car exhaust, and CFCs from aerosols. This releases greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide, methane, water vapor, nitrous oxide, ozone, and fluorinated gases into the atmosphere, and therefore causing global warming through the greenhouse gas effect. Effects of climate change in Kenya include floods, droughts, desert locusts, diminishing water bodies and stream flow, rising maximum and minimum temperatures, loss of habitat, loss of biodiversity, and diminishing wetlands. This has led to adverse effects on wildlife and marine life, human displacement, economic losses, water conflicts between communities, climate refugees, and famine. Response to climate change involves mitigation through reducing the emissions of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, adaptation, and financing the required adjustments.
It is estimated that by the year 2050, the world's population will hit 9 billion people, thereby necessitating a 70% increase in food production. Unfortunately, current food production is decreasing due to challenges such as declining ocean health and natural resources. This is further aggravated by climate change, which negatively affects the agricultural sector.
So where we are standing right now is our weather station, and there are around 37 like these ones across the country and other smaller ones. So what our weather station does, it has instruments that help us to record the weather and observe the weather. So there is rain gauges, there is a sunshine recorder, evaporation pans, and behind me here there is a Stevenson screen where we have thermometers to record the temperatures. So this data is transmitted to a central location, and we have years and years of this type of data that allows us to do trend analysis, for example, and in some instances also helps us to predict the future. And so this is an evaporation pan to measure rate of evaporation. So there's water, they put water, and then they come and measure how much is left. Then this is a wind vane, says speed of wind. So depending on how fast it's moving, then you can tell how fast the wind is. So these measure soil moisture at different levels. So each of them goes to a certain level. So this is a rain gauge. This and these are both rain gauges. Once it rains, the observer would come and pour out using a measuring cylinder and know how many millimeters of rain have happened. This one is called a Stevenson screen. It houses thermometers, so maximum and minimum thermometers. And so the minimum temperature is measured at 3 in the night, and then the maximum at 3 in the afternoon. So 3 afternoon is the hottest time, and then 3 a.m. is the coldest time. Well, to be very honest, I kind of found myself here in a very interesting way. So, you know, in Kenya, when you finish your high school education, you apply for university and you get at least 4 choices. So very interestingly, meteorology was my fourth choice. I wanted to be other things when I was growing up, and meteorology was my last choice. And I got picked to go to the university to study meteorology. I tried to change it to do something different, didn't work out. But within about 2-3 months of studying it, I was like, this is what I love doing. We learned a lot. For me, it helped me learn a lot about creation, about the systems, weather systems, in very, very fascinating ways. So I did that for 4 years and graduated, and then got employed at the meteorological department, where I've worked in different sections, but currently I work in the climate change division.
Tell us about your typical work day. What does it look like? What do you do?
So a typical work day for me, or rather I should say, I do not have a typical work day. So every day is very different. Depends on what we're working on currently. So currently I'm working on a study that looks at how heat waves, how can we characterize heat waves in Kenya, and what are the impacts of those heat waves on health. And concurrent to that, I'm also working on a study on differentiated gendered impacts of climate change. So I'm comparing how do women perceive climate change in Kenya, which is a developing country, with another country that's a developed country. So I would be looking at data. I would look at trends of climate to see how climate has changed in different parts of the country, and therefore then check, for example, in the second study, how are women impacted by those changes that they see. And then at times we also work on downscaling projections of climate change. So these projections are run on a global level. We use these projections to downscale to the local context, and then for application and for planning.
The youths make up over 70% of Kenya's population and also bear the greatest brunt of climate change. To this end, there is need for youths to be actively involved in climate action in agriculture. This can be through businesses anchored on value addition, innovation, as well as capacity building of rural communities.
These are windsock, sindio? These are what? Alafu tukiangalia ni kama trouser. Hapa ni kubwa, alafu kwa chini ni ndogo. Kwa sababu gani? They allow air to strengthen, sawa? So the air enters here, alafu inatokea huko, sawa?
These kids we see here, they've come on a field trip of the weather station. And I think it's at this point that the interest starts to be piqued and generated, because at this point then they would probably ask themselves questions, what's the importance of what is being done here, and how can it fit in with what I want to do in the future. And for me, something else that I really found interesting is a lot of people think study of the weather is maybe geography. In fact, when I say I'm a meteorologist, most people tell me, oh, I didn't do geography in school. But very interestingly, meteorology is actually physics. It's mathematics and physics, where we look at the physical systems and see how they move things, the pressures and the winds and all that. So pay attention in your physics class. You never know where it will lead you. And then at the university, there is a course BSc Meteorology, which is what I did. So it's also a very interesting course and very intensive also. When I was in school, we were actually just 3 girls in my class and about 30 boys. That tells you a bit about how people view it. But the advice I'd like to give is it's a male-dominated field, but we're just as good and just as capable within the field. So go for it.
There are global frameworks and agreements which guide progress of climate change response, such as the Sustainable Development Goals, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the Paris Agreement.
What are we doing as a country to contribute towards the keeping of temperatures below 2 degrees and preferably 1.5 degrees Celsius? With reference to the Paris Agreement, Article 2.1a, there is actually 2 ways we can answer that question. And Kenya honestly is doing a lot. So in our nationally determined contribution that we've submitted to the UNFCCC, it is very ambitious. So we are working on reducing emissions by up to 32%. And there are plans also to update this nationally determined contribution as we go along the years. So that's one way to think about it. And also just to mention, energy sector is expected to achieve 100% net zero by 2030 or 2050. So Kenya has very ambitious plans to be able to do that. There is the initiative by the Ministry of Environment to increase tree cover, which is one way that we contribute to the removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And then a second way that we can answer that question is what are the statistics telling us with respect to how our temperature has risen across the country. So we recently did a study where we looked at temperatures from as far back as we are able to, which is about the 1960s for most of the stations. And for the coastal region, we see we are above the average by about 2.1 degrees Celsius, but the average for the country sits at about 1.5 degrees Celsius on an average. Now, this may feel like it's sounding like it's alarming, but what the Paris Agreement talks about is on a global level, and once we aggregate all the temperatures across the world, and we are currently at 1.1 degrees Celsius, but if we reach 1.5 on an aggregate, then that will mean even higher temperatures for Kenya. So already the temperatures that we see in Kenya, we are observing the impacts. One thing that I like to mention that really stands out is the fact that in the highland parts of the country, we already see increased temperatures to the extent that we now have mosquitoes in regions that we never had mosquitoes before. And that is a direct impact of the rise in temperatures. That these regions already are arid and semi-arid, so the tree cover already naturally is lower, and the tree cover usually would help to maintain temperatures at a certain level. So when we do not have that already, we see the temperatures would go higher faster. And it's also based on the fact that since the land is bare, whatever is emitted from the sun is just directly radiated back into the atmosphere. It's not redirected by trees or by vegetation. And that's one reason why arid and semi-arid and desert areas would have temperature rise a bit faster than other temperate regions. And an intervention directly would be tree planting in areas that had trees. And there's a danger also in planting trees in areas that naturally do not have trees, because it leads to modification of the ecosystem. And the ecosystem is even the plants and animals that depend on that ecosystem, once it's modified, they are not able to, and you find movement or even collapse of the ecosystem. So planting trees in areas that had trees would be a useful way to help with the temperature situation.
There exist several climate change mitigation strategies in agriculture, such as use of efficient livestock production systems, use of clean energy, and nature-based solutions by way of conservation, restoration, and sustainable land management, all of which are aimed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions and increasing the carbon sinks.
Kenya is one of the V20 countries which are the most vulnerable to climate change, since the impacts are worse and there is low capacity to adapt due to lack of finances, technology, and access to knowledge. Kenya has mainstreamed its climate change response through the Climate Change Directorate, National Environment Management Authority, National Treasury, all government ministries, county governments, universities, and research institutions. It is worth noting that the country has received support through collaboration with development partners and international organizations such as the World Bank, Africa Development Bank, the United Nations, and embassies. The country has over the years ramped up its efforts in combating climate change in the environment and agriculture sector through development of county climate risk profiles and specific projects and programs and interventions such as irrigation, incubation of SMEs on agro-processing and value addition, tree planting, water harvesting, sustainable land management, and restoration of mangroves.
We are going renewable, particularly with energy, geothermal, wind energy, and even more recently solar energy. So in another few years we should be able to be net zero within the energy sector. And then for the rest of the sectors, so this would depend on plans that the government has, but already we've seen a lot of efforts that are being put forth by government, particularly Ministry of Environment with support from the rest, to be able to, for example, increase tree cover and even encourage climate resilient development. So reduce the emissions even in industries, in infrastructure and in building.
In terms of legal framework, Kenya has laid out its climate change policies, strategies and plans such as the Nationally Determined Contributions, National Climate Change Response Strategy of 2010, Adaptation Analysis Report of 2012, National Adaptation Plan of 2015 to 2030, and the National Climate Change Action Plan of 2018 to 2022, among others.
It is a fact that Africa is among some of the most vulnerable regions of the globe because of a number of factors. And as such, then adaptation becomes a very important key to help us secure our futures. And the challenges include, for example, increased vulnerability that is driven by, we see the most extremes in this part of the world. So, for example, you viewers may be aware that we've had consecutive seasons where we've had reduced rainfall, more than what is the normal, and this has led to a drought that has continued for a while. We've seen in the media pictures of livestock dying, and then followed by a flood where again the livestock die. So this perpetual cycle keeps of frequent and more intense extreme events perpetuates the vulnerabilities of most African countries, and this leads to lower adaptive capacity. Yeah, so that's one. Second also is financing. As African governments, most have very different priorities, and working to, for example, reduce poverty takes a lot more than just what the government can be able to do. Therefore, international cooperation is very important in ensuring that African countries are able to adapt to the changes that they are seeing and the impacts that they are already experiencing. Well, for COP27, there is talk on operationalizing the global goal on adaptation. And for African countries, and mainly countries that are vulnerable and developing, this is a very important fund. And this should be able to enable countries to adapt to climate change.
We are here to convince the world that we need support, and that support must be at scale. And that, of course, that we are not responsible for the negative effects of climate change, that we contribute only 4%, and that the developed world must do something, and do something as quickly as possible. In the early days, there have been IPCC reports to support our assertions that Africa is not responsible. I think this, the whole world has agreed upon. The developed world has also agreed to be on board to ensure that we start moving on the various issues we've raised. We've also made the case that Africa indeed is suffering, and is suffering much more these effects. The LODCs are suffering more these effects. That the issues of climate change are not issues we must play with, because the very survival of humankind is dependent on them. This case has been made. We talked about the flooding in various parts of Africa, from South Africa to Zimbabwe, to Zambia, to West Africa. That there's flooding, and this flooding is destroying our infrastructure. That there are droughts leading to food insecurity, energy insecurity, water insecurity. I think the case has been made that indeed, because of the devastating flooding, the issues of loss and damage are getting worse and worse each year. This is a case we've made. and we are on board.
There's kind of a push-pull that is going on between developed countries and developing countries, with respect to funding going into the global goal on adaptation and how to operationalize it. I think COP27 presents us a unique opportunity to be able to further push and see that hopefully by the end of it, maybe we have something. And if not, then we have a way forward towards achieving it. Something else is a facility on loss and damage. A lot of African and small island developing states have already faced tremendous damage from climate that can be directly attributable to climate change. So a loss and damage facility is something that countries have already talked about and put on the floor, but we've also not been able to make it go through into the UNFCCC processes. So this is another opportunity that we have to talk about that. Last year we put forward an agenda for consideration of the special needs of Africa, but it was kind of kicked out. Hopefully with COP27 we can find ways to kind of revive that conversation and see if we can have special consideration for African circumstances. In the climate change conversation, it could tend to be very negative. Like, this is happening, this is bad and all that. But I believe it's not all negative. We can each play our individual roles and contribute to improving your spaces. So if we put in individual effort, then I think that's very useful. And it would be in very small ways, minimal ways. Don't leave running water, put off your bulb, just things that don't look like a lot, but actually do cumulatively mean a lot.